When we think about the history of the atom, there's a very specific story that probably pops into your head, right? It's the one we all learned in school. But what if I told you that textbook version is just one chapter in a much, much bigger story? Yep, that's the one. The classic story kicks off right here in ancient Greece. We're told that Leucippus and his student Democritus looked out at the world and had this incredible thought. What if you just keep cutting something in half, and then in half again? Eventually, you have to get to a point where you just can't cut it anymore. They called that final, indivisible little particle an atomos, which literally means uncuttable. So the core idea they had was actually brilliantly simple. Everything that we see around us is just a different arrangement of these eternal, unchangeable atoms. And they're all moving around through this infinite empty space they called the void. All the amazing variety in our world, from a rock to a river to you and me, it all came down to the size, shape, and the way these little building blocks combine. So, is that it? Is that the whole story? Oh, not even close. And this right here is where our investigation really kicks into gear. Because what if this absolutely revolutionary idea wasn't just a singular stroke of Greek genius? Well, it turns out that thousands of miles away, and maybe even earlier, thinkers in classical India were wrestling with the exact same questions. Several different schools of Indian philosophy developed their own incredibly sophisticated atomic theories, and the roots of these ideas might stretch back centuries before the Common Era. And look, these weren't just carbon copies of each other, no way. As you can see, you have the Nyaya, Vaisheshika, the Buddhist, and the Jaina traditions, and each one of them developed a totally unique and often competing version of atomism. And these ideas were all deeply tied to their own broader philosophical and spiritual worldviews. And they got there using pure logic. This is a classic argument from Indian philosophy. Just think about it for a second. The reasoning goes like this. If you can divide things an infinite number of times, then a huge mountain and a tiny little mustard seed would both contain an infinite number of parts. And if they both have an infinite number of parts, well, how can one be bigger than the other? It's a paradox. The only logical way out, they argued, is that there must be a smallest, final, indivisible unit. Okay, and this is maybe the most crucial part. Not all atoms were thought of in the same way. The way each of these traditions conceived of this fundamental particle completely changed their understanding of reality itself. I mean, this table just lays out the deep differences so well. For the Greeks, atoms were eternal, uncreated stuff that just always existed. For the Hindu Nyaya Vaisheshika school, they were also physical materials, sure, but they were created by a divine source. But then you have the Buddhists who took this even more radical step, totally in line with their whole philosophy of impermanence. For them, atoms weren't things at all. They were momentary flashes of existence, tiny little events making up the flow of experience. Just think about that. A completely different way of imagining the building blocks of our reality. And here's another fascinating contrast. Democritus, he argued that atoms only had objective properties, like size and shape. Things like color or taste or smell, he thought those weren't real. They were just subjective experiences that happened when different atoms hit our senses. But a lot of Indian and later Islamic traditions, they totally disagreed. They believed these qualities were real and that atoms themselves could actually be inherently sweet or hot or blue. So you might be wondering, okay, how did these ideas spread? It's just so important to remember this wasn't all happening in total isolation. These concepts were part of a vast, interconnected ancient world where knowledge traveled, was debated, and evolved. This timeline really puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? We see the idea popping up in India, then it appears independently over in Greece. It travels with Buddhist scholars along the Silk Road all the way to China. And then, much later, it's picked up and creatively developed by brilliant philosophers in the Islamic world who came up with their own theological atomism, or kalam, where they debated both the Greek and the Indian ideas. This was a conversation that stretched across millennia and continents. And that, of course, brings us to the most important question of all. If this was a huge global conversation, why is only one voice the star of our history books? Why is there so much silence about everybody else? Well, the answer, it turns out, has less to do with ancient history and a lot more to do with modern politics. The history that we're taught is never a pure reflection of the past. It's a story. And every story is told from a particular point of view. To really get this, sources like Krishna Kumar's book Political Agenda of Education are absolutely essential. They help us look beyond just the facts of history and start to ask how the story of that history was built, and maybe more importantly, for what purpose. This quote from the author himself is just so revealing. He's explaining how he grew up completely internalizing a specific story taught in schools, a narrative that was designed to serve a purpose. It just goes to show you how education systems don't just teach facts, they shape our entire understanding of the world, including who gets the credit for major scientific and philosophical breakthroughs. And this right here gets to the absolute heart of the matter. The modern focus on the Greeks as the sole originators of ideas like atomism is, in part, a legacy of colonial-era education. These systems, naturally, emphasized European achievements, and that often came at the expense of non-Western contributions. This created historical blind spots that are still with us today, and they affect not just the colonized, but all of us. So look, this isn't about taking a crown from Democritus and just giving it to someone else. It's not a competition. The whole point is to stop thinking of it as some simple race with only one winner, and instead to see the history of human thought for what it really is: a rich, complex, messy, and truly global tapestry, woven by countless hands. So in the end, the story of the atom isn't just a Greek story. It's a human story. It shows that when brilliant minds are faced with the same huge questions about reality, they can arrive at startlingly similar yet beautifully distinct conclusions, all across different civilizations, using different logical tools. And that really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? If the simple story of the atom was hiding this much complexity, it really makes you wonder, what other stories that we just take for granted are actually just the first chapter of a much, much bigger book? What other hidden histories are out there just waiting for us to ask the right questions?